Hello, this is the Overcoming Resistance podcast. I am your host, Louis Carell. My co-host, Sean Mahoney, is away for this two-part episode. Friend of the show, Michael Salazar, is joining us once again to discuss the topic of exercise selection for powerlifting. Michael and myself have both competed in powerlifting and have coached several high-level athletes in the sport. This is part one of two parts on this topic. This is a lengthy discussion, and part one today will be laying some groundwork with how to think about exercise selection for the sport overall, and more specifically, we go into depth on the movement of the squat. Part two will discuss the bench press and deadlift in more detail. Part two will release in 2 weeks from the release of this episode, scheduled for December 28th. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show. Hey, Mike, welcome back to the podcast. Appreciate you making some time joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
So today I thought I'd have you back on to loop back around. 2 episodes ago, we talked about exercise selection for building muscle. And I know we both have our roots in powerlifting. You have a lot of powerlifting clients. And I thought it'd be a good idea to take some time to go back and re-loop and talk about exercise selection for powerlifting.
Absolutely.
Because it's also its own kind of deep topic. And so not everything we talked about with building muscle will directly apply to specifically powerlifters, because it is a sport. So there's some aspects. So, we have to think about the fact that what is the sport, right? It's to lift the most weight for one rep max on the squat, bench, deadlift under competition rules on a competition day, right? So really, what is that? That's a force production, right? So we're trying to lift the most amount of weight via force, using the muscles we have in a technique under the rules. And so, I was talking to you before, but we seem to be in some agreement that there's kind of like 2 ways we can take this topic for people to think about. So when exercise selection comes down, since we have the skill component, the sport component of the lifts, outside of doing the competition lifts, which we would both agree is important at some point in an athlete's developmental cycle or getting close to competition, because that is the sport.
Yeah.
You could also use variations of the competition lifts to address various aspects that the athlete might be deficient in. And that could be technical proficiency. That could be maybe that there's a weak point in the force curve for them. That seems to be a big limiter in their ability to complete the lift. Or maybe there's maybe they need to overload. They're not used to being exposed to the heavy percentages or loads on the bar, or maybe there's mental, right? Where it's like, oh man, every time I try to bench 300, I just can't, but they can do 295 for a double, right? So logically they should be able to do 300, but mentally something about that number, they have to break that mental hurdle. But those would be done with variations of the lifts, right? So a squat variation, bench variation, or deadlift variation, right? That's what we were agreeing on.
Exactly.
And then we have another category, which people usually think of more as like bodybuilding work, but it's accessories. These would be maybe your isolation lifts. These would be lifts to specifically build the primary movers in the lifts themselves. And that could be, like a tricep extension for triceps for bench press, or, that could be a dumbbell bench press, which might be less specific than a barbell for the chest and the bench press. And so we were going to kind of go down this and kind of dissect, you as a coach, you have a lot of powerlifters, some very successful ones. We both compete in powerlifting, so I thought it'd be great for you to kind of walk through and give some people some idea on how you think about these different categories of exercise selection for the power lifts and the squat, bench, deadlift, and then what some of your favorites are for some of these different aspects. And then you were also mentioning about the importance of building lean muscle mass for powerlifters, which I think is getting talked about more, but can you re-talk about that point with me?
Yeah,
for the listeners about how just important it is to focus on building muscle for a powerlifter over their career.
For sure. Yeah, it's definitely crucial not to get, especially, a young lifter, maybe in their teens, early 20s, it's important to not get married to a weight class. It may be a weight class that you're in for a couple of years, but ideally you want to outgrow that weight class until you get to a point in your development where you're in a weight class that's really more suited for your height. And like we said earlier, we were talking off air about weight classes are honestly kind of like height classes. So if you're someone who's 5'9", 5'10" male, 75 kilos is probably not where you should be in the long run. You might be a little bit underdeveloped muscular wise, and it's okay to start there. But ideally in your career, you should grow into a bigger weight class that's more appropriate for your height. And that's where that aspect of focusing on building lean tissue comes in. And that rate of development is also going to be genetically dependent, and also whether you're tested or untested. Obviously, a natural power lifter is going to have a slower rate of muscle gain. But regardless of tested or untested, you should be trying to fill out a weight class that makes the most sense for your height.
Yeah, so kind of the ideal endpoint for any powerlifter would be for whatever height you are, the amount of lean mass you can carry at the top end of that weight class while still making appropriate weight cuts as needed for competition day, right? Because on either the day before for some meets, or some meets it's the morning of, you have to make a certain weight to compete in that class. So you might be able to be a little heavier walking around, but then you could cut weight to make the class. Whatever that kind of allows you to be as lean as you can comfortably be while not sacrificing, injury,
Exactly.
without increasing your potential for injury, because maybe you're too lean, you don't have as
Yeah.
much fluid, or your joints aren't as strong, or
Hmm.
your caloric intake can't be as high to fuel recovery. You kind of want to be as lean as you can be comfortably and sustainably while having the most lean mass for your height, which would allow you the potential to be the strongest. What you were telling me off air is that there's some pretty good research showing the correlation between how much lean mass a lifter carries in relation to their total, meaning the
Yep.
more lean mass a lifter carries in a weight class, the more likely they are to have a bigger total.
Absolutely.
And we were discussing the reason for that is, well, what is contracting to lift the weight? What is producing force to lift the weight? If this is a force
Exactly.
production sport, it's muscle.
Yeah.
So the more muscle we have, the more tissue our nervous system can integrate into moving the load to lift the most weight.
Yeah. And one thing to consider is we have genetic variability, and you can't control your insertion points, muscle architecture, fiber types, things like that. Some people are just going to be more gifted, and that's, you can't control your genetics, but you can control your building muscle. And obviously, people are going to have a little bit different rates of muscle gain too, but you can still focus on putting on more lean tissue to be the best power lifter that you can be. So, person A may be able to be 200 pounds and squat 600, bench 400, deadlift 700. Person B may not have those same genetics for absolute force production, but they can sort of do their best to close the gap in terms of filling out their muscularity and having as much lean tissue they can, so that way they can reach their own potential. So that's one thing that I think it's very important that powerlifters focus on in terms of long-term development. And we know that lean tissue is a fairly slow process, but if you can control that and you can just continue to trend up, and I always tell my powerlifters, just like I tell my hypertrophy focused clients, that we don't need to force progressions on things like tricep rope extensions or hack squats or things of that nature. But if we see that trending upward across a year, 2 years, say, I always like using the example of Romanian deadlifts because it's one of my favorite exercises. So say you take a male and take him from doing pretty textbook form RDLs with 315 for like 8 to 10 reps, and 2 years later he's doing 405 to like 445. That's probably going to correlate pretty well with added hamstring and glute tissue, and therefore should carry over pretty well to his conventional or sumo deadlift as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because basically the overview you're giving is there's a lot of factors, genetic. There's a lot of things that go into what makes a good athlete in any sport, but specifically powerlifting, there's a lot of things beyond our control.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing we can control if we're competing in powerlifting is how much muscle you build.
Mm-hmm.
Well, within your genetics, but you can try to
Yeah,
maximize that over your
exactly.
career, which maximizes your potential. Besides, of course, maximizing your ability to perform the technique
Yeah. So we have those
as
two.
you get stronger, right? So you
Yeah,
kind of
we have
have a
those two
couple
things.
different levers. You
Mm-hmm.
can maximize your nervous system production of force,
Mm-hmm.
build as much lean muscle as you can build, and then of course maximize the amount of technique that
Yeah,
you
and
have to do the perform the lift. There's kind of like three areas that we can focus on,
yeah,
but everything else is it's what
stick.
you were given and what
Yeah,
your
yeah,
parents gave you,
exactly.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people ask me like, "Oh, like what do you do for calves?" I'm like, I just pick the right parents, man.
I mean, can you build some calves? There's some research maybe saying we
Yeah,
could
yeah,
probably
you
build a little
can.
muscle, but
It's pretty
probably
genetic.
pretty genetic, right? So it's what did your parents give you? And that goes for everything, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but in the sport of powerlifting, so that's what we're focused on today.
Yep.
There's a couple different areas that people can focus on. So, we kind of talked about that we have these two major categories. We got the competition lift variations,
Hmm.
and then we got more of our muscle building specific work. So I thought it'd be useful for people if we kind of walk through maybe each lift, squat, bench,
Yep.
deadlift, kind of in the competition order.
Okay.
And maybe you can kind of give us some overviews as a
Hmm.
coach about how what are some of your go-tos and why are they your go-tos?
Okay.
And we'll start with kind of the variations. I kind of
Hmm.
categorize them in three areas. If you think there's more areas you'd like to touch on, feel free to add. But I think more along the lines of, if we're thinking of variation for the squat, depending on what the athlete needs, you could pick something that's, focusing on technical proficiency.
Hmm.
You could pick something that's focused on a weak point in the force curve,
Yep.
or, in some maybe a little bit more rare, but there's cases for it, but maybe something that's focused on overload or addressing that mental component.
Yeah.
Right. And if you think there's more you want to add, I think that feel
Yeah.
free. But for the squat, if somebody comes to you, you got an athlete, kind of a clean slate, you don't have much history,
Hmm.
right? So you don't have their preferences, what's worked for them in the past, because we were talking
Okay.
off air as a coach, the more data you have of an athlete's history, the better decisions you can make. But if you're
Absolutely.
just got somebody who's newer, or you're a newer athlete, let's say you're just starting to compete in powerlifting,
Hmm.
you're more intermediate, right? Your squat doesn't always just go up because you squatted
Yeah.
anymore, right?
Hmm.
We want to make that clear that if you're a beginning powerlifter, I'm generally just doing the competition lifts somewhat frequently, just focusing on getting better at them over time and just adding load to the bar when you can will generally net you pretty much the most progress you're going to get as a
Hmm.
beginner. But at some level in what we would call intermediate phase, that's probably not going to net you the best progress. And this is where these other areas might come up, right? Which is where you got to focus on more technical aspects or
Absolutely.
force production or overload mental, building more muscle, right? The lift itself is not usually enough.
Hmm.
So you got a newer athlete, clean slate, don't really have a lot of history, but they're an intermediate. They've kind of gotten through all those beginning gains. Their squat really isn't moving from just squatting. And let's say you see a technical issue. What's the most common technical issue you see? Or maybe technical issues if there's multiple. And then what
Yeah.
are your favorite lifts that you normally pick as a first trial to address that?
So I would say, assuming someone is a low bar squatter, one of the most common things I see is kind of falling forward, sort of at that midpoint to high end. And I think that has to do with just overall ability to brace properly. And sometimes that could be also a quad weakness thing. So there's a couple things I'd like to address. So one of my go-tos, like typically my lifters will be squatting, doing some sort of squat variation 2 to 3 days per week, depending on the individual and what their individual recovery capabilities are. But one of my go-tos is going to be a high bar squat. And the reason I like the high bar squat is that it is a little less specific. It's a little bit of a load limiting variation. So we're not accumulating as much fatigue as using a low bar squat where we can handle higher absolute loads. And it sort of elucidates where we can work on things. Because sometimes if someone really sucks at high bar squats, they just have smaller weak quads. So we might even further target additional stuff like hack squats and things like that. But high bar is one of my go-tos on a secondary day. But I might also use a safety squat bar if I feel they need an even more of a challenge to that ability to keep an upright position. I mean, we've both done safety squat bars. If you're not used to it, it's going to try to pull you forward. And the first couple times you're like, oh, wow, like I say if I haven't done safety squat bar in a while and I implement it, my upper back is actually pretty sore
Yeah.
after the first session reintroducing it. So it kind of challenges that ability to keep that thoracic extension because it wants to pull you more into like a little bit more thoracic flexion, which isn't necessarily harmful, but it may not be ideal from a technical proficiency standpoint. So that safety squat bar squat is just allowing us to improve our bracing and stability So those two are my go-tos for secondary squat patterns, is high bar and safety squat bar. And I'll typically program those in sort of a DUP fashion. For those who don't know DUP, it's daily undulating periodization. So that's basically just utilizing different rep ranges throughout the week to target different things. So the reason I like to program those a little higher rep is just because, again, that load limiting variation. So if we're doing triples on our primary squat day, we might do sets of sixes or sevens on our secondary for our high bar or safety squat bar. And that way we're staying fresher for that primary day, because we don't have to use as high of an absolute load.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think it makes sense when you're talking about the technical issue you tend to see most often, especially, in the low bar, you start to see that chest come down, you start to see maybe the knees kick back. So it could go either way. Is it a
Yeah.
bracing or is it a quad?
Yeah.
Both of those variations kind of put the knee a little bit more forward. The load's
Yeah.
displaced a little bit more forward because it's not as low on the back.
Exactly.
And then, of course, as the load comes up the back and then forward, there's a bracing component you mentioned. Like I've definitely experienced the upper back soreness from the safety squat bar,
Yeah. And you
for
can
sure.
even take those and add in, you can sort of stack variations. So I like pause squats a lot. I'll use pause squats sometimes on secondary or tertiary squat days, but you can even, if you want to limit someone's load or really, really challenge them, you can stack that variation and do like a paused high bar squat or a paused safety squat bar.
And would
And
you
then,
say that would probably be a good idea under the context of maybe a more experienced lifter, you might see multiple issues coming up, but you only have so much work you can do in a week, right?
yeah,
Because you're mentioning the recovery limiting, right? If they can only
exactly.
squat twice a week, but say an experienced, pretty strong male lifter, that load's pretty high. So
Hmm.
every time he squats, it's enough load, even on a lighter variation, that it's pretty hard on recovery.
Exactly.
But you notice maybe he has a little bit of chest down,
Hmm.
plus he stalls maybe a little bit. He has a sticking point halfway up. So
Yeah.
maybe you would use a safety squat bar pause.
Hmm.
You're helping with both. You're addressing the bracing, but then you'd also be addressing the fact that he has to stop and then exert a lot more force from a stalled position to get through that sticking point. So you're addressing both
Exactly. Hmm.
aspects. You're mentioning don't be afraid. If you're a lifter and you're looking at your own videos and your competition history and you're like, oh, there's more than one issue, right? But I only have so much recovery, and you still want a competition squat because maybe you are closer to a meet, you can't afford to
Yeah.
be as less specific,
Hmm.
then you can stack them. Or if
Yeah.
they're just super strong,
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe it's a
This
fatigue management too, where it's
exactly. I
it's
was gonna
a it's a
mention that.
recovery management tool.
Mhm. Yes, and that is an interesting thing that I recently implemented, and I have to give credit to. I don't know if you're familiar with Steve Denovi, PRS Performance. Pretty smart guy. He did a really good video on distance traveled. And so it really goes into anthropometrics and how people are structured. Some people, the way they're built, certain lifts are just going to accumulate fatigue a lot faster for them. And so I've kind of noticed in certain body types, like we have to limit our overall squat volume. They may only be able to handle one or two heavy low bar squat sets a week, and then the rest we might need to stay at pretty low percentages or use like a really load limiting variation. So I think that I've seen some people be critical of stuff like tempos because they're like, oh, why are you intentionally slowing stuff down, blah blah blah. But what tempos allow you to do is really limit the absolute load and focus on that bracing and execution. So you could use a tempo or you could use a pause. Tempos, I'll only have them slow down the eccentric because there's no need to go slow in the concentric. But if we're slowing down that eccentric motion for like maybe a 3 count and then like a 1 count pause, so I'll program that as like a 3-1-0. What that's allowing us to do is potentially stack a load limiting variation onto another load limiting variation. So like a high bar tempo squat. So you could utilize these different variations within each other. So like it could be a high bar squat and it could be a high bar pause, or it could be a high bar tempo. And so with individuals who are very, very, very strong, or a combination of being very strong and also just being an individual who accumulates fatigue at a faster rate, those really low limiting variations can allow us to get some productive work in at relatively lighter loads.
Mm. That's a really good point. And for those who haven't listened to your first appearance 2 episodes ago, episode 4, it might be worth going back and listening to that because we do touch on some of the considerations when it comes to exercise fatigue and kind of what that really is, because that's kind of where we are in this discussion, right? In this exercise selection, and how forces go through different tissues and how some tissues can be limiting, right? So for the squat example, maybe the tendons around the knee, or maybe the forces through the lower back are the
Yeah.
limiters. It's not the quad, it's not the
Hmm.
glutes being able to exert force, but it's the tendon the quad's connected to, or the fact that as a low bar squatter with pretty long femurs has to
Yep.
bend over a lot, that
Yeah.
that lower back becomes. And as a powerlifter, you also have to think, well, in the same competition day, they need that lower back again to deadlift.
Yep.
And you're also training deadlift in the week, maybe multiple times, 1 to 2. So you have to
Exactly.
want to also be fresh for that. So there's a few things to consider. And so if you haven't listened to that, it's a good episode where I don't think we need to rehash all those definitions here.
Hmm.
But I think you've almost added, because I gave 3 categories, I think you kind of almost added a 4th one in a way, which is kind of like, if somebody gets strong enough and experienced enough, variations aren't just about a technical issue. They aren't just about a weak point in the force curve. They aren't just about mental or overload for the nervous system. There's also just making sure that they can still do something similar enough and recover from it,
Yep.
right? A low bar, you kind of got me in a lot of ideas here, but a low bar could be maybe hard on somebody's shoulders. So
Hmm.
maybe the high bar or safety squat
Yep.
allows them to squat without that load. Maybe it's not so much for the brace or the knee.
Hmm.
Maybe it's just to save the shoulders. The
Yeah.
tempo could be a great option if somebody likes a lot of rebound in their squat. Maybe their knees take a big beating, the tendons. The
Hmm.
tempo forces the quads to work more, the less force to rebound off the tendon saves the knees, right? As you're
Absolutely.
mentioning, or maybe it can be a teaching tool for bracing. If maybe
Yeah.
let's say that they, for some reason, maybe they don't dump hard, maybe they don't have their knees kick back hard, but they just seem to have this instability in the lift. Maybe the tempo could teach them how to just maintain that brace, right? So you're almost mentioning, and you're also talking a lot about load, being able to just mitigate how heavy it is, thus keeping the stimulus, right? Because in
Yeah.
previous episodes, we talked about the need to train for building muscle,
Hmm.
close to concentric failure, close enough to concentric failure. So, for powerlifting, you don't have to be as close to failure
No.
for
Yeah.
building as
That's a
building
good point.
muscle
Yep.
for building strength, because there is that more neurological component.
Hmm.
But you still want to be somewhere, right? We don't want to do maybe a set of 6 with 50% of that 1 RM for
Nah,
that variation. That might be way too far away to
hmm.
really have much, but maybe you don't need to do it with a 2 RIR either,
Hmm.
right? Maybe you could be at a 5 or a 4 RIR, but there's still a good amount of load for someone pretty strong, right? That could
Exactly.
still be a 500-pound safety squat bar, maybe for a 700-pound squatter. But if you have them do a safety squat bar with a tempo, maybe now it's in the low 400s,
Yeah.
and thus you're saving those tissues for that better performance on the competition squat. That's the ideas
Exactly.
you're spurring in my head as you
Absolutely.
mentioned this extra
Mhm.
category.
And one thing that I want to see is that over time, we may keep that secondary day, that load limiting variation at a relatively lower RPE or RIR, but it will still improve and trend up over time. So we can keep it at sort of a constant like RPE 6 to 7, and we might play around with that RPE a little within the context of that specific block. But that secondary, I'm never, very, very rarely am I going to push that past like RPE 7, because that's not the goal. We're not trying to safety squat bar a stupid amount of weight. We're just using this as another variation to build the main movement. But if we see that safety squat bar or that high bar trend up over 6 months, a year, we know that's probably going to transfer pretty well to our main competition low bar squat.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense in that context. So it's just pretty interesting how what seems like a fairly simple sport, when you start getting into how to move the needle, there's a lot of areas to consider. And you mentioned the limb lengths too, right?
Hmm.
I always think about the bench press with this example, where it's like, yeah, somebody's bench press, if they have really short arms, how much force is going through the elbow or the shoulder, right? When they have to bench to competition standard, where if somebody has really long arms, those shoulder joints and musculature might be taking a lot more of a beating. And so maybe some of your variations are designed to allow them to bench more often while mitigating that, as well as kind of what you're saying in that same realm of load mitigation. So it's pretty interesting ideas, because some of those, when I was competing, may have come up through trial and error, but I maybe never thought about it quite under that context of, hey, I've got a lot of, maybe I don't have the best like leverages for this particular lift. Maybe my variation should be something allowing me to recover, not just addressing, because generally, if you think about it, you're mentioning almost the other side of a coin. The way you're spurring this idea is that if you are targeting something technical, you are targeting weak points in the force curve, or maybe something overload or mental. In a way, those are all more taxing on
Yeah.
the specific area, right? I mean, if the chest fall is the issue, you're now using the safety squat to push it harder. That actually is getting hit even harder than just low bar.
Yeah.
So that's even more recovery demand on that specific area, or, if somebody needs to overload, then of course they
Excuse me.
load.
Yeah.
You're actually going the other side where you're saying like, hey, we actually need to focus for you as an athlete, because you don't recover as well. We need to actually get load off the bar. We need to make sure your recovery is even better while squatting.
Exactly.
So it's a pretty interesting idea that actually I don't hear a lot of coaches talk about. Most people focus on trying to put more into whatever the weakness is, which
Yeah.
actually might be counterintuitive, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's kind of different from the muscle building stuff we talked about, because on some of these variations of the competition lifts, while on exercises where we want to build muscle, we already talked about getting pretty close to failure. On these movements, we can afford to be, and it oftentimes makes more sense to be further away from failure and finding that sweet spot where we have enough stimulus to drive adaptations, but still be pretty fresh afterwards, so that the next time a squat day or a bench day or a deadlift day rolls around, that you can perform well on especially the primary day. So in the sense of how we want things to move, we're not trying to push things as hard on those like secondary and tertiary days. They are just building blocks, if you will, to build that main competition lift.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And so it kind of goes back to the overall layout, not just what are we doing today, but nothing exists in a vacuum. So how does today
Exactly.
impact the next day and the
Yep.
next day?
And
And
that's
then
one thing
set
where I'll kind of make sure that I make very clear is we don't want to overshoot our RPEs on those secondary and tertiary days, because that can negatively impact your primary day. And if you're a powerlifter, you want to feel good on that heavy low bar squat day. So I always got to keep that in mind.
Yeah, from the sport context, it makes perfect sense. And the bigger picture. And I know we kind of got away from our squat examples, but I think that's pretty important, because what you're laying is a foundation for
Mhm.
many areas that will apply to every single lift, every single variation, every single consideration. And so I do have a question for you that kind of goes a little bit further away from the squat specifically, but we've talked about the importance for the powerlifter to build muscle. And
Mhm.
we can do it. We can talk about it now because we're kind of already there. And I don't want to lose that thought. But
Yeah.
one question I always ran into when I was competing, and one that I always felt a little tricky, is when somebody's just trying to build muscle, it's pretty clear what a hard set is, how you're counting volume, what type of metrics you're tracking for the most part, right? I mean,
Mhm.
a quad, a hard set for quads is kind of a hard set for quads. Maybe not 100% one-to-one, but they're pretty close if your lifts aren't too you know, variable, like maybe a leg extension is not the same as a high bar squat, right? For one to
Yeah.
one. But a
Mhm.
leg press and a high bar squat are probably pretty close if it's a hard set close to concentric failure to build muscle.
Yeah.
So when we're counting volume, you can kind of, in a way, think about, okay, I need 10 sets for quads, and then you could divvy that up over different lifts to mitigate fatigue, high bar, leg press, leg extension, etc.
Mhm.
That's for building muscle. That's pretty clear. But when we get into powerlifting, the goal is still to build muscle. So that maximum stimulus to build muscle is still those hard sets. But
Mhm.
we also have volume in a powerlifting program usually that isn't close to concentric failure, which
Mhm.
is what you're talking about with the lower RPEs on the squat
Exactly.
variation, or maybe you're doing even lower RPEs on the competition. Maybe you're doing heavy loads, but it's just for like 1 or 2 reps, and you don't want that to be close to failure. Maybe that's an RPE 6
Yep.
or 5, right? More from a technical proficiency with the heavier load to do a single rep, and that's very technical for the competition, which is a 1 rep
Exactly.
sport. How are you as a coach conceptualizing the volume then? How are you thinking about tracking for the when you're trying to assess how much of load you're giving an athlete for, say, the squat and the quads and the glutes, which are primary movers,
Hmm.
trying to build those primary movers? How are you counting the volume from the squat variations in those cases?
So there's going to be like a general, and obviously this depends if I have previous data from a new lifter, but there's like sort of a general range where I want to be in. And then from there, it's just about assessing that feedback, both from the lifter themselves and their performance, and then making adjustments. So we have, let's say I have an individual that squats twice a week. We will have our primary day, and then we'll have our secondary day, and we'll have, so we'll just keep it simple and say primary day they're doing low bar singles with some back downs in like the 4 to 6 rep range. And so we might have, depending on how I see they respond, anywhere from like 2 to 4 back down sets after their top single on a primary day. And then from there we'll look to focus on more some hypertrophy movements. So they might have something like a leg press or a hack squat or a pendulum squat. And then same thing on the secondary day, we'll have the our main movement of the day. So we'll say high bar to keep it simple. And then we'll have another hypertrophy focused movement. And the amount of volume is going to be adjusted based on how they respond. But I always want to target both of those vectors where we're, on primary day, we have that technical proficiency, but we're still getting some hypertrophy stimulus via the other, maybe more braced movements that aren't as fatiguing, like a leg press. And then at the secondary day, we're perhaps focusing on that low limiting variation at a low RPE, but still stimulating. And then we may push something like a hack squat or a pendulum squat to continue to build those quads and in a more stable environment. And I'll kind of play around with that volume depending on how I feel they recover. But they're they're not, it's not going to differ dramatically from person to person unless someone has very unique structure.
I gotcha. So it kind of sounds like you're understanding that maybe the load and reps and RPE or RAR you're using for the main lifts, that would be like the low bar squat in our example, and then the high bar, may
Mhm.
not be the most muscle building stimulus per set, but there's still going to be some because it's not a
Yeah,
black, white on off. It's a sliding
exactly.
scale of
Yeah.
stimulus. And so you're understanding that that's coming with fatigue and maybe some muscle building. You're using evidence-based to kind of give you a starting point for overall load per sets. And
Hmm.
then you're just seeing how do they recover, how much, work do they need to keep the strength movements moving. And then from there, trying to fill in the rest of their recovery capacity with muscle building movements. Is that kind of the framework I'm getting?
Exactly. That's
Okay.
perfect.
I mean, that's how I approached it personally, but I just, it's always good to hear from other people because as you
Mhm.
start to hear these topics come together and you understand the importance of building muscle, it's like, well, how am I objectively tracking this? Maybe can be a little bit tough. And so I thought it'd be useful to hear from an experienced coach like yourself who's helped some athletes put on some muscle over their competition career, maybe how you approach that.
Mhm.
And so kind of getting back to the squat. So we originally talked about the technical, and we kind of briefly talked about maybe a weak point. So for the squat, what's the most common weak point in the force curve type of situation you've seen? Is it at the bottom? Is it midpoint? And if an athlete is going to have a point where technique looks pretty good, there's
Mhm.
no major breakdown, but they just seem to hit that wall and they slow down just enough they can't keep it moving. But if they would have got past that point, they would have finished. Is there a common place you see that in the squat?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of cases it's going to be just, excuse me, building the quads. And we know that the quads are the prime mover, the quads and glutes really, and adductors to some extent. But you and I have been around long enough when we were taught to sit back in the squat, and it was really different to how it is now, where we really now we're focusing on building those quads. And if you look at the example of any high level Olympic weightlifter, they all have huge quads. They're doing these crazy high bar squats. He's got these Chinese weightlifters like I forget his name, Lu Zhaojun, doing like 650 high bar at like 160 pounds, something crazy.
Yeah, I've
So
seen them.
really, yeah, building those quads as the primary movers is going to be the biggest thing in terms of, obviously besides technical proficiency, it's going to be the biggest thing that kind of moves that needle forward in terms of absolute strength potential. Because like we said earlier, once we have that technical proficiency down, it's just kind of a long game of building more muscle over time.
I gotcha. And maybe kind of what you're giving me a little bit is the way you're framing it is when somebody has a sticking point not seeming to be hugely technical, that it's probably knee extension strength, quad
Yeah.
related
Mhm.
strength that tends to be limiting, where maybe the quads are overloaded, they can't contribute any longer. The hips tend to usually be strong enough to keep going, but if the
Yeah.
quads kick off and the hips can't make up for it, they're going to slow and then maybe not be able to finish that lift. So you're saying you don't really focus on, the pauses you'll use maybe from a building technique, getting the
Mhm.
athlete to take a little load off the bar, slow down the movement, think through it, but you're not using that to address the fact that they might stall halfway up or near the bottom. You're saying, nah, not so much of a focus. I'd rather just focus on getting their knee extension strength a lot stronger because that
Absolutely.
tends to be the thing that moves them through. And that could be, like you've already said, a safety squat or a high bar.
Hmm.
And then, of course, you've mentioned other variations that are more muscle building specific, leg press, hack squat, pendulum. So is that kind of the general area that you're going?
Yeah, yeah. So if I'm focused on building up that musculature, my go-tos are going to be, excuse me, like hypertrophy movements that are less fatiguing. So we already kind of went over that in a prior episode, where if I just want someone to build big legs, like they don't ever have to barbell squat if they don't want to. We can
Right.
focus on something like a hack squat, or my personal favorite, a pendulum squat, where we can really get into maximal knee flexion in a environment where we have that external stability of like that back pad, and you're not having to, you know, stabilize like a free weight barbell. So I will use, if available, the pendulum squat or hack squat or leg press if it's there, as that sort of muscle building variation within the program to continue to work on building up those quads and adductors and glutes as well, because we know the glutes are a factor.
Yeah. But I guess most athletes tend to have a higher deadlift than squat. And
Yeah,
that might kind of point loosely to the fact they probably have a greater capacity for hip extension strength than knee extension because of the difference in demands
yeah.
due to where the bar is, right? Because usually
Hmm.
so maybe, if your squat is pretty well below your deadlift, it's probably a knee extension strength
Oh, for
limitation for
sure.
the most
Yeah.
part,
Mhm.
not all of it, but there's other technical aspects there. But, we could say, well, it's not like your squat and your deadlift are 30 pounds apart, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you kind of focus on that. So that's pretty interesting. And actually pretty simple. So for anyone listening who's maybe an intermediate, yeah, if you feel like, hey, my technique's pretty good in all my videos, but I'm still just having trouble, I still tend to slow down. But if I could just get past that, you're just saying, hey, just keep hammering knee extension strength generally, keep getting bigger
Yeah.
quads.
Hmm.
For the most part, that's going to be like a way to go. And then the last one that I mentioned was and I don't know how often you see it. It's usually a lot rarer, but do you ever see the need for athletes? Maybe they're pretty good. Maybe they don't really have they don't, everything seems to be pretty balanced technique. There's not really like a huge slowdown point in the lift, but they just seem to have a mental hurdle, or maybe they just under those heavier loads, they just get their nervous system doesn't seem to coordinate well. Do you ever see that often where you need to overload or do some type of heavier work than the competition?
You know, back a couple years back, it was more popular to use overloading variations like board presses, for example, on bench, or like a for the squat, something like a heavy walkout, or
Right.
a pin squat above parallel. But honestly, I don't really see a need for overloading lifts like that anymore. as long as we have sufficient exposure close enough to those high percentages. And so what I'll do is I'll a lot of the time sort of increase that RPE within our block. So it's not like say I have someone doing squat singles on their primary day. We're not always staying at RPE 6. I mean, there may be some cases where I may keep someone there where they're just maybe progressing and that RPE 6 is getting stronger, and that's fine too. But especially if I want to get someone, we're close to competition, we do want to have sufficient exposure to those RPE 8s and 9s. And so I think as long as you're getting a sufficient amount of exposures to those 8s and 9s to where you know what that feels like, you know what it's like to sort of have to grind out a lift, I think that should build that confidence and like, okay, I know what an RPE 9 feels like, and I know what I'm capable of. So then come meet day, once we've peaked and tapered, it really shouldn't be anything dramatically different from what we're accustomed to. It's not like I'm having someone attempt to squat 100 pounds more than they have in training. Usually we have a pretty good idea of where they should be at. We'll ideally get a little bit of a bump in strength if we peak and taper correctly, but it's not going to be like some crazy dramatic increase. So as
Uh,
long as we have sufficient exposures, I don't think that confidence should be a big issue, unless it's like an underlying psychological thing that we just need to work on.
right. So it's a lot less common. So we probably won't focus too much on it. But yeah, you're right. You're right about the heavy walkouts and all that kind of stuff and the board presses. I remember those days when that was really popular. And I guess it can make somebody feel good in the moment, but
Yeah.
how often does it translate to the lift on the day of competition?
I think
Um,
sorry. I think that it might, in those cases, especially back in that day, it was more of a, I don't even know if a social media thing or a little bit of an ego stroke. And like I even did it back then. You load up a deadlift with reverse bands and pull 90 pounds more than you've ever pulled raw, and you're like, oh yeah, that was awesome. I pulled, a 700 reverse band, but it's like, okay, how much reverse was the band taking off, and how is this actually going to transfer to your competition lifts? And the reality is not so much. I see this, people still use reverse bands. I see it now more in the hypertrophy space with hack squats. People will reverse band a hack squat, and they'll use like the fucking thickest bands I've ever seen, and they've got 6, 7, 8 plates per side in the hack squat. And initially, someone who doesn't know, then be like, "Holy shit, that person's hack squatting so much!" And then I see the band, and I'm like, "Okay, the band's taking off 180 pounds, and it's slingshotting you out of the hardest part of the lift." I would rather we start lighter and just be honest and build that strength over time. And same thing with, raw squatting and benching and deadlifting. I think where a lot of that thought process came from was from equipped powerlifting,
yeah.
because the suits and the bench shirts did assist you, or do assist people who still do it, out of those bottom positions. So you get in a squat suit and you squat, and that's going to sort of slingshot you out of the bottom. You put on a bench shirt, or even just like a slingshot, and it's going to catapult that bench off of your chest. And I remember years back, I haven't used slingshot benching in my programming in years, but I used to use it sometimes just as a way to get a little bit more exposure at those like overloading weights. But I just really don't think that there's a need for that anymore.
Yeah, maybe what you're saying is if you peak well and you
Mhm.
give the athletes the proper exposures, you probably don't need to go so far above and beyond in terms of overload, right? And I think
Exactly.
what you're saying is true. I mean, if we think back to that time, I remember the equip lifting, and a lot of that did translate from there for sure, without a
Mhm.
doubt. Um, but I also think some of that was also maybe the messaging at the time was you can't train the competition lifts as often, you can't do them as much. There
Oh
was a
yeah.
lot of conjugate narrative. Now, I don't think conjugate's bad. I think there's a lot of great ways that somebody could organize that. But
Hmm.
I think back in that time, a couple, maybe a good 5, 6 years ago, even longer, there was a strong narrative that like, hey, you can't do the competition lift week in, week out for, 5, 6 months going into a meet. You'll stall. It's too much exposure to the same thing. You're
Hmm.
not going to continue to get stronger. So you got to use all these variations, and maybe you're not doing the competition lifts often enough that you don't have that same exposure. And what you're saying is, that's not true. We found
Yeah.
out that, variation in rep range is enough variation to keep the lift stimulative in a lot of cases. If you
Yeah.
mitigate fatigue and then we taper things and we give the athlete enough exposure, a lot of what that overload or mental related work was doing tends to wash away,
Yeah.
right?
If you
The need
think
for it
about it,
washes away.
if you think about it, it's come almost an evolution. Whereas these sort of, because I remember I did conjugate very, very early on. And so you would rotate between a different max effort squat variation once a week. And so you might only actually be doing a low bar raw squat like every once in a while, if you even did one, because you had box squats, you had cambered bar squats, safety squat bar, box squat, all of these variations. And then same thing with the dynamic effort days. And I think what we see is that what's evolved is that we know now that a lot of those variations just don't transfer well to raw lifting, but also it's okay to have variation, but if you vary things week to week, it's too hard to have those adaptations to progress on something. So I'm not gonna, if I give someone a secondary squat day variation, let's say safety squat bar, we can ride that out for multiple blocks, several months. If they're progressing, why would I change that? It's not like one week I have someone on a secondary day do safety squat bar, the next week high bar, the next week tempo high bar possible, something like that. Like we wouldn't have sufficient exposures to create the adaptations specific to that movement pattern, because I'm sure even with something as simple as a machine, if I'm away from like an incline hammer strength chest press for 3 or 4 months, my first exposure back to it, I'm gonna have to start a little lighter because it feels a little foreign. I need a couple sessions to get into that groove now, and that's something that's in a fixed position. You're stabilized, so now you apply that to something that requires a lot more technical proficiency, like a safety squat bar or a
Right.
tempo high bar squat. Why would you swap that every week instead of allowing that to progress? So I think variation is good as long as it makes sense and you only change things maybe once a block or once every couple of blocks, because you're just changing things week to week just doesn't make sense in terms of allowing someone to adapt and progress in that movement pattern.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it goes for both building muscle and powerlifting, right?
Yep.
Strength,
Mhm.
right? Because a lot of the gains you make strength wise on a lift initially are very much neurological, just even due to the fact that it's slightly foreign, right? You mentioned with the incline hammer strength.
Yeah.
That's a very stabilized movement. You wouldn't think there's a huge learning curve, but there's still enough. So
Hmm.
you don't know if the strength you're making on that hammer strength press for about, for some bodybuilding is actually building more lean tissue, or is that just the nervous system getting slightly more refined? And it can take a couple of weeks or, even a little bit longer for someone to really hit that groove where, okay, these like newbie neurological gains are milked
Yeah,
out. And now we're riding the progression via lean tissue. And then
exactly.
the same could be said for a powerlifter in some sense.
Excuse me.
Okay, we're doing the safety squat bar because we have a chest fall pattern. Well, how
Mhm.
long do you think one session is enough for the nervous system to
Exactly.
go, hey, we've rewired a little bit on how we squat in general
Hmm.
no, it's the same thing. You might initially have a lot of like, oh, that's really bad. So the loads are pretty low. And then you have a newbie adaptation. And then you start to have a ingrained motor pattern change start to take place. And that again can take weeks or multiple blocks or months, right?
Yep.
So I think it goes both ways, that some stability in the training can, like you said, help you actually realize the real adaptation you're going for, whether that's a motor control aspect for maybe strength development, or if that's building lean tissue for building muscle.
Exactly.
And another thing you mentioned, I just want to say it because I think it needs to be said, is we're finding out that via research that a lot of the portion of lifts that maybe help build muscle are primarily due to the stretch position.
Yep.
If you are using super strong bands that take off hundreds of pounds on your hack squat,
Hmm.
and you don't have any injury prevention issue, it's not because your knees are sensitive or you're trying to alter the force curve so you can thus do the hack squat comfortably.
Hmm.
You're just taking away from the most beneficial part of the lift. I mean,
Exactly.
let's be honest, right? The bottom
Exactly.
is the most beneficial muscle building stimulus part of that lift. You put all these bands on, you're taking off a bunch of load. Great for the ego, bad for
Yeah,
the quads.
exactly.
Unless you need to alter that force curve for a short period of time, if it's due to like, oh, my knees are achy. So I'm going to take a little load off the bottom, spare my knees as a recovery rehab tool, and then slowly take the bands off to resume. The goal should always be having the most load you can in the stretch position because that's the most muscle building position we're starting to find out,
Yeah.
right? If you have to use a band to alter the force curve for building muscle, I would view it more as you should probably doing the least amount possible
Yep. Hmm.
and trying to get away from that via recovering and rehab or maybe switching the exercise.
Exactly.
I just think it needs to be said. I see a lot of
Absolutely.
that online about people with the bands, and it looks cool. But once you start to understand that
Yeah,
you're
it's
going the wrong direction a little bit
mhm.
there.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I guess if someone wanted to implement it as a variation every once in a while, maybe for a block with bands that are not taking off that much and they just kind of enjoy that variation and then they're going to rotate back in non-banded hack squats or pendulum. I don't think that's an issue, but the issue I see is banding the shit out of a hack squat and being like, oh, look, I can hack squat 6, 7 plates. And it's like, okay, but your quads are small. So what are you accomplishing? We're not going to a hack squat competition. Like if your goal is to build quads, then you need to do it in a way that's going to be conducive to building quads. So if you're a power lifter, you need to be executing it in the same way that I would be executing a hack squat for the goal of just building the biggest quads possible. Because if you can do that, then that's going to transfer to your squat. And even when you think about absolute load, if you can get away with using less weight and getting more stimulus, why wouldn't you? It's funny because at this point in my lifting career, I'm always excited when I find some sort of variation where I am like, oh shit, I'm weak as fuck on this. And that allows me the opportunity to progress on it. Like, this sounds cool to people, but like once you get to a certain point where you're maxing out every machine or you're using the heaviest dumbbells in the gym, sometimes it's almost kind of annoying having to figure out ways of making it more challenging.
yes, yes. And also, just on that note, because I think it's worth being said, you start getting strong enough, you start to not want to do maybe lifts you respond really well to. Your delts might blow up from seated overhead dumbbell press,
Mhm.
but when you got to kick up hundreds
Yeah.
every session for multiple sets, and maybe you're dieting and you're tired,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Like you're at a
Or
point
like,
now where it's like, hey, just setting up for this lift is
yeah,
enough of it.
like a leg press where you might be able to do 8, 9, 10 plates per side. Like, yeah, it might be look cool and impressive to someone looking on, but like loading and unloading that is kind of annoying.
Plus the warm up, right? You're not going to
Yeah.
start with like 7 plates here, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, part of powerlifting is you're trying to get as strong as possible. So that
Yeah.
warm up's going to get a little bit longer, and that's just something you got to co-sign to.
Yeah.
But for someone trying to build muscle, I agree with you 100%. I'm like, yeah, I've gotten to a point now where I'm excited to do lifts that need less load because it's less warm up, they're less fatiguing. I
Hmm.
could probably handle a little bit more stimulus because I can do 4 sets instead of 3 because I'm not drained from trying to set up for the 3 sets.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
that brings up a good variation. I haven't used it as much, but I have used it with some success. It's just one of those things that a lot of people don't have access to, but it's pretty popular amongst a lot of powerlifting coaches is the belt squat.
Mm,
Belt squat's a good way to get some extra volume as well without that same axial loading that a barbell squat will have.
now, do you, because we kind of covered the more squat related variations. I was going to ask you about some of your favorite lifts for the prime movers in the squat, the quads and glutes.
Yeah, let's go
The
on.
belt squat kind of almost fits into both.
Yeah,
When you think about it, are you thinking about it from is this one of your squat slots, or are you programming it after, say, high bar in a muscle building, or does it vary depending on the athlete, what they can handle?
it definitely varies. I'll usually programming it. in after one of like the main squat slots. But I haven't experienced this with any particular lifters, but I've seen some other coaches have success with the types of lifters that may not respond to a lot of squatting, maybe the fatigue very easily, where they may use that belt squat as its own primary slot on like a secondary day. And so that kind of limits the absolute total fatigue for someone who may fatigue very easily from barbell squats. So they're still getting that pattern, but they're not getting the same fatigue of that axial loading, someone who maybe has long femurs.
Yeah, or maybe they also maybe they have tight shoulders, long femurs, right? You just
Yeah.
got so much tissue being stressed so heavily that maybe for them. Okay, and then so we agree that maybe well, you said adductors, but I don't think most lifters need to focus on adductors
No, yeah, I
for the
wouldn't be
squat.
too
It
worried
usually
about
comes
it.
with all the squatting volume.
Exactly.
So if we try to distill the squat down to which two primary movers are people probably going to be wanting to build over time, it would be the glutes and the quads.
Yep,
Would you agree? Okay.
absolutely.
No more hamstrings. Okay, that's
No.
2010. We're away from that now. Hamstrings are
I
great.
guess,
We need them for other things,
yeah,
but not really to squat. So
yeah.
give me, give the listeners a couple of your, I mean, say 2 or 3 top picks that you would pick for the quads and then the glutes. And if they overlap, that's fine. But
Yeah,
what are
okay,
some
so
lifts you usually go to for building muscle?
part of this obviously depends on what someone has access to. So assuming someone had access to everything, my go-to that I would have programmed for everyone, actually one of the gyms in my area that's a lot of my lifters go to is getting one soon. My go-to would be a pendulum squat. The reason why the pendulum squat to me is the gold standard is because you're in a externally braced position, so you don't have to worry about bracing a barbell or anything and that stability, so you're already stable. The way that it's set up and the way that I like to do it, I always wear like squat shoes with heels. If you do it correctly, use squat shoes, place your feet not too high up on the platform, sort of middle to bottom, depends on obviously everyone's individual structure. You can get maximum knee flexion, like I'm talking hams to calves, and you don't need a ton of load. Like it'll humble the shit out of you if you do it correctly. And so that's a way to 100, like time and time again, every time I reintegrate pendulum squats, my quads blow the fuck up. So if someone has access to a pendulum squat, that's my go-to. Number 2, a little bit more common in gyms, would be a hack squat. Same kind of premise. If you execute it correctly, you can get a lot of great quad stimulus, some glute stimulus as well. So I would say pendulum is going to be a little bit more targeted to quads, whereas hacks still quads if you execute it correctly, but you might have a little bit more adductor and glute stimulus there. And then after that, I may aim for either a belt squat, if available, or a leg press. And that's the thing is like not every machine is created equally. Some leg presses just kind of suck. So that's not something you can control unless you have a fortune and you can just build your own gym. But most people, you go to a Crunch or maybe your local powerlifting gym that has whatever leg press that they found, like a Cybex or something. So it can be a little hit or miss. But yeah, that would be in order: pendulum squat, like I'd say 1A pendulum squat, 1B hack squat. Those are both fantastic as muscle builders. 2, I'd say a good leg press, and then 3, a belt squat. And the reason I put belt squat third is because I haven't found, and I haven't tried every belt squat. They're not bad, but I haven't found a belt squat setup that I felt that I could get sufficient quad stimulus relative to hip flexion. I always feel like I get a little bit more hip flexion relative to quad flexion in belt squats, just kind of the way that they're set up and angled usually. So maybe if someone just has weak glutes, a belt squat might be a better option. But if we're really, really focusing on that knee extension, pendulums and hacks are my go-to.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that's a good overview for kind of like why you tiered them. So then what about the glutes? If that's the secondary area. Now we already covered that for most lifters, the
Yeah.
quad will be the primary area, but you don't want to ignore the glutes. You
Mhm.
actually target the glutes for most lifters, or do you let the residual glute volume from squatting, deadlifting, focusing on deadlift variations, etc. Do you let all that fill it in?
Yeah, and I think it depends on the lifter and their individual goals as well. It's not too common that I'll do a lot of direct glute work with someone outside of their hinges already.
Right.
Now, if I have a female who's both a power lifter but also interested in building her glutes, we may have more targeted glute work. And I do one movement I really like specifically for the glutes and has some quad stimulus as well is like a really well executed and controlled step up. You could do this with dumbbells, or you could do this with a barbell, or if you want to be in a really stable position using a Smith machine. And the way that I instruct people to execute it is, if we're focusing more on glutes, is having like about a 45-degree forward lean, and that way we're getting more hip flexion and really trying to control that. So that's the movement I use more so with. I use it a lot with like bikini or wellness type girls, but I think it has utility across the board, not just from just having a nice ass perspective, but I think that strong glutes are indicative of someone who's just going to be a strong overall lifter. I'm sure we've talked about this before. Most people think, oh yeah, someone who has big arms and a big pecs, that's like someone strong. But if you're an experienced lifter and you see a guy who has a huge back and a huge ass, you're like, oh, that guy's fucking strong as fuck. Like, I can already tell. Like, glutes are an indicator of someone being pretty damn strong. The first time I ever saw,
Especially for powerlifting.
yeah, the first time I ever saw Dan Green, I was like, this man has the biggest ass I've ever seen. And he squatted in his heyday like high 700s and deadlifted 800 plus. So,
He pulled 900 a few times, not in
oh
meets,
yeah,
but
yeah, he did pull 900 a couple times. I think he pulled 900 conventional ones too.
yeah. So yeah, it's one of those things where the having big strong glutes really doesn't hurt, especially for the deadlift. And you know what? I mean, it just ensures that usually for most people, the stronger like link in the chain, which usually is the hip extension strength, doesn't ever lag behind or become its own, you know,
Yeah,
issue in the squat. So that
but I
kind of
think,
covers the squat, and really a
yeah,
lot more general information, technical stuff that really carries over. We don't have to rehash for the bench and the deadlift. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a rating and review wherever you are listening, if you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast. If on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Please let us know if you did or didn't like the episode, and all feedback is helpful. We will be releasing another episode 2 weeks from now. You can find us at Overcoming Resistance on YouTube and at Overcoming_Resistance on Instagram. Have a great day and take care.